я хочу надати слово Карлу фон Габсбургу.
Well, Igor, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think I'm connected. Should I speak English or German? That's one question I have to ask you, because that I couldn't see from the beginning.
English. English, auf English.
In English. Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, absolutely, with pleasure. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this very important day. I'm very glad to know that the Pan-European friends and the friends from Hanns Seidel Stiftung and everybody else are participating in highlighting the importance of that meeting, and just in this way also highlighting the importance of Ukraine and the Ukrainian situation. I mean, when I saw the program and I saw that the title that was given to my lecture is "Without Ukraine, Europe is not complete," I was going like, well, yes, that's pretty obvious. I mean, that's completely clear to anybody who knows Ukraine, to anybody who knows how to appreciate that important part of Europe. That's something which is quite obvious. But of course, it also begs the question on it: how big is Europe actually? Where are European borders? How does that work? What is the historic dimension of Europe and the actual dimension of Europe? And of course, for that, there is an incredible amount of answers. I mean, when you go about the geographic positioning of Europe, it is fairly simple to see the borders to the west, and because it's a big water, and the borders to the north where there's a lot of ice. But in all other directions, it's a bit more difficult to kind of say where are actually the European borders, because it depends on the standards that you're applying to it. I mean, if you go to let's say historic standards and go back to the Roman times, you know that the Mediterranean has been an interior lake of Europe, and Europe was happening around the Mediterranean. If you're going back to a time which was a little bit further on, there were other dimensions that you could apply to Europe, whether it is geographical, whether it is culinary, whether it is religious, whether it depends really on the parameters that you put onto Europe. And I think one thing which is very important, not important for our friends in the Ukraine and those that are in the know anyway, but to tell a lot of our Western friends on how much Ukraine has always in history been an integral part of this Europe and not just an eastern fringe to Europe. I like to go back in time with one small element, which I think is very impressive, especially for all those that are speaking German, and that's the fact that historically in the Middle Ages, Ukraine was part of the Hanse, like many of the Hanse towns in Germany and the whole commercial area in the north. Ukraine was part of that, and therefore was also, like wherever the Hanse was active, with all the trade that they had with the rest of the known world at the time, with the connections they had to other countries, they had a much more liberal development, and they had a much more open mind about everything than those that were not connected to this commercial entity. And the Ukraine definitely was part of that. Kiev was definitely a city connected to the Hanse. And with that, it just showed also the border that is in existence between what is today Ukraine and what is today Russia. Because, of course, Russia was not part of the Hanse, and it could be seen. I think one of the interesting elements was at the time, and I'm sorry if I'm going that far back, if you're going back to the time of the Mongol invasions, the Golden Horde, which was coming in the north, was let's say a military occupation that was going all the way through Ukraine. Kiev was even for some part the capital of the Golden Horde, but they could never stay there because they were not able to deal with let's say the population that had this spirit of the Hanse. So they had to withdraw, and so then the capital was pulled back and was first in Kazan and then in Moscow. It was just that they could not stay there because this part of Europe, which is Ukraine, had taken another development of that part, which was the Khanate. And even if you kind of continue in this development, you still can see the same thing today. When you look into Russia, you see very much still the roots of the Khanate there. I mean, the current president definitely is more a Grand Khan than let's say a modern president. But I mean, that also was at the time of the Tsars. The Tsars also had, of course, elements of being much more Khans than being emperors in the European sense. But Ukraine was definitely part of Europe at the time, and was defending its European values at the time, and therefore did not allow this part to stay in Europe. So I mean, even if we go that far back, we can see how much Ukraine was part of Europe. And of course, that brings me back to the topic that without Ukraine, Europe, of course, is not complete. Geographically, anyway, I don't have to say anything to that. But so for my feeling as a passionate European and a pan-European and a former member of the European Parliament, of course, the current status of priority partnership with the Eastern Partnership and the European neighborhood policy is not enough. I would, of course, wish to see a much stronger connection that would be in existence between the European Union and Ukraine, because, of course, I see Ukraine as a classical future member country of the European Union. That is, for me, something which is completely clear. I think, especially, this has to be seen when we are looking at the light of what were the founding principles of the European Union, which we tend to forget quite often today. Once again, of course, I am preaching to the believers here when I see who is listening to our conference, but I think it is important to kind of point out that the founding history of the European Union is, of course, something which is pointing to the fact that it is incredibly important to have Ukraine also as a member. The European Union, European community, basically was funded as a consequence of the Second World War and as a peace project. And it was, we can look from whatever perspective we want into it, it was the most successful peace project and the longest lasting peace project that humanity has produced at any given time. And if we are looking at the situation that Ukraine is in today, I think all the more it is important to point out that Ukraine has to be part of that peace project and has to be part of the protection that, to some degree, the European Union should be able to give. Of course, when the European community was created, it was not possible to talk about those countries, or talk, yes, about them, but not see them as members which were behind the Iron Curtain. But we have now passed quite a couple of decades since the Iron Curtain finally has fell, and most of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, European countries behind the Iron Curtain, have been able to join. And I can see in discussions with many friends in European institutions that, of course, they are saying Ukraine being the second biggest European country, it's a huge element to integrate. It's very difficult, but I think that can and should not really be an argument. I think particularly when we look at one aspect, which is that the structure of the European Union is the most modern political structure that we are actually having in the world. The founding fathers of the European Union were the most modern politicians and modern thinking politicians, not only of that time, but even thinking of all the time of the development that we have seen coming up today. They were the ones that were recognizing the fact that the concept of nation state is a concept that has lost some of its impact, that it had its time. Of course, the size of nation states is determined by language and culture and religion and transport and communication. But all these elements have actually changed over the last couple of decades, and therefore also the concept of nation state has to change to some degree. I'm definitely not somebody who wants to eradicate nation states, not at all. But I think they have to have their right place in the same way as they had their right place when they were created. And therefore, it was necessary to find a new structure where the collaboration of the different nation states would be possible for the benefit of the continent that they are comprising, in this case, Europe. This had to be put into a system, and it's a system that, amongst other things, is also described in the Maastricht Treaty, which is the principle of subsidiarity. And I think it is always incredibly important to kind of point out that the basic structural principle on how the European Union can actually work is the principle of subsidiarity. And it's the principle of subsidiarity, how it was seen and developed in its origin, and not necessarily how it is interpreted today. Principle of subsidiarity today is very often seen only as something that is describing the relationship between the European Union and between its member states. But that's not the case. The principle of subsidiarity is the only true bottom-up political system that we know, which has to comprise all parts of society and administration within the European Union. It cannot only describe the relationship between the institutions of the Union and the member countries. And of course, this principle of subsidiarity also would allow the growth of the European Union, and therefore it is something which logically also comprises those countries that should also in the future be part of this European Union, which is an entity that is not complete without quite an amount of countries still being part of that. What I think is always very interesting is I have the possibility to travel quite a bit outside the European Union and outside of Europe. And whenever I'm frustrated about institutions not working in the European Union and faults of the European Union and the problems, I just have to talk and listen to what, let's say, the political representatives of other areas, of other communities where states are working together are actually, how they are pointing out, how they are seeing the European Union and how they are seeing Europe. I mean, one element of countries that quite often is not that much talked about are the ECOWAS states, the Western African states. This is also a community of states that is working together in a relatively close connection. They have a common currency. They have quite some institutions that are working together. I definitely do not want to compare them to the European Union. But if you talk to the politicians of the ECOWAS states, they all look to the European Union and say, this is the system of the future. This is the system that we want to see in the future of a collaboration of states. And of course, the biggest achievement that they see in the European Union is a European Court of Justice. That's just something that they see as something incredibly important. But they see the European Union as the model for the future. And so often we hear discussions in Europe where people are saying that elements of the European Union are already basically elements of the past, which I think is complete nonsense. It is definitely the most modern political structure that we can possibly think of in states working together. And I think it is, of course, particularly important if we are looking at how Europe is supposed to position itself in the future. And over the last couple of weeks, we have learned a lot. I mean, I'm not going a lot into a question of Afghanistan here, but we have learned a lot on how important it would be. And I'm terribly sorry to have to use the word would be and not that it is, that this European collaboration would properly work. We have seen a tremendous development over the last couple of decades on who are the powers and the powers to be in the framework of, let's say, the world society, because we have done in our lifetime this incredible move from a bipolar world to a monopolar, pure American world to a multipolar world where a lot of regional powers are showing their power, where they're positioning themselves. some of them only really regional, some of them reaching out much further. I mean, if I'm just talking about, I'm not talking about China in this case, but think about countries like Turkey or like Iran, which are definitely showing how much they are active trans-border and how much they want to become regional powers. All the more, I think it is important to think on how Europe can position itself in the future, because we have all the possibilities to play an important role worldwide and not be just a regional powers that are kind of meddling a little bit in our surrounding. But for that, one thing that it definitely needs, and which is of absolute greatest importance, is the fact that the European Union is coming up with a working concept of a foreign and security policy. And I think we have just seen this in the last couple of weeks, that this is something that does not really work currently. We have seen that Europe is definitely not taken serious as one of the powers to be, and that is something that has to change, because we definitely have the necessary political and economic background to be actually a serious a world power that which has to be taken seriously. So I'm just reminding you of one thing which was for me an absolute shocking element, which was when the whole case with the poisoning of Mr. Navalny happened. And Mr. Navalny was brought into Germany, and against the suggestion of all member countries, the High Representative of the European Union, Mr. Borrell, decided to visit Russia. And he was treated by his counterpart, Mr. Lavrov, in a way which was, I don't know what else to say. It was just embarrassing. I mean, he was basically slapping him in the face during a press conference where he said that he would expel quite an amount of European diplomats, which happened as an information during a press conference. If Borrell would have had just the slightest bit of self-respect at that stage, he would have probably gotten up and said, I'm not talking to this man anymore when I'm getting treated as the representative of Europe like this in Russia at all. This is just not acceptable. Well, he didn't do it, and that just shows some of the flaws that we are having in our concept of foreign and security policy. And I'm particularly emphasizing this because, of course, it is, if we're talking about the Ukraine, it is one of those countries where we as Europeans have to show quite some strength about the values that we are representing. And when I mentioned before for Europe only as the values, let's say the economic values and the political values, I think the European responsibility goes quite a bit beyond that, because there are so many values that we are taking for granted in the European Union or in Europe, in most countries of Europe, but they are there. I don't think they should be taken for granted, and that starting with very basic things like freedom, like liberty that the state has to organize so that we can live our freedom, like the freedom of the press. These are like democracy. These are all elements that are not automatically given to us, but that have to be actually defended every day of the year and every hour of the day if we want to keep this also for future generations. And it is definitely under a threat from many of our neighboring countries, and it is definitely under threat on the borders and partly on the occupied territory of Ukraine. So I think Europe has, in this respect, really to speak with one voice and demand the European principles and values being also adhered there in this specific case when it comes to the Ukraine. It is, of course, completely unacceptable on what is happening with Russia, what is happening in Europe, especially when you have a power that has guaranteed the borders of Ukraine. But I am absolutely sure that you have been talking already quite substantially today about the problem of the non-respect of the borders. I am every day looking at the list of violations of the Minsk agreement happening in the Donbas area. And I have to say, it's absolutely shocking that this is not really getting published, but we are just going past that. We're going to the, we're just moving on as to business as usual, while actually in one of those countries that we are so closely connected to, things like this are happening. What I found absolutely fascinating, I don't know who of you have watched yesterday the press conference by the Ukrainian government on the question of the Wagner, of the mercenaries that have been the Russian mercenaries that have been active in the Donbas areas, that have been actively fighting against Ukraine, and where Ukraine made a move in whatever way it was to actually arrest as many of them. Just the fact that this is happening, I have not seen in the Western media any reaction to that so far. And I find this quite shocking, because I think also these statements have a great impact on lots of other elements which are happening. I'm thinking, for example, currently we are listening to that in Amsterdam, in the process that is happening regarding MH17. We are listening to the representative of the victims. And again, it is something which is not really represented. This is public knowledge. This is getting live streamed in different languages. And still, we are not pointing out that this is really reaching to the basic values that we have to defend, and that we as Europeans have to defend. And we can only defend this if we see Ukraine and if we take Ukraine as an integral part of not only of Europe, which it is anyway, but also, of course, in the future of the European Union. So we have to overcome that problem. And of course, then we also will then be able to appreciate the incredible resources that the Ukraine has and that Ukraine would have for the entire European Union. I'm not talking about only, let's say, resources in the ground. I'm, of course, also talking about the incredible human resources that they have. So in this respect, there are a lot of problems that we have to solve within the European Union. But in the discussion between those that are saying the European Union has first to be solidified in its current contracts before it can enlarge anymore, we have to say, in the conflict between enlargement and deepening of the European Union, this is not a conflict. This is not a conflict that we artificially can see. We have to see both is necessary. We have to take all the necessary steps to bind Ukraine into the European Union as fast as possible as a full member. That is my full conviction, if we want to be true to our principles, to our history, but also if we want to be true to those principles in the future as a European future together with the Ukraine. So thank you very much for giving me some time here on your panel.
Дякую, любий Карл. Будь ласка, у кого є питання?
Busca el cargador. Busca el cargador.
Que yo lo encontré, pero papá que está.
Добрий день, я Андрусенко Михайло. Добрий день, я Андрусенко Михайло, член Панєвропейської молоді Київщини. Хотів вам подякувати за ваш виступ. Ми з моїм колегою Богданом Червичним виконуємо проєктну роботу, і у нас виникло таке запитання. Чи змінилося сприйняття України протягом останніх 5 років, тобто європейським співтовариством, тобто з 2017-16 року і до сьогодення, чи змінився якось образ України в очах європейського співтовариства? І чи змінилося саме європейське співтовариство? Дуже дякую.
Well, I have to say, personally, I don't see enough change in the real perception, because where we would have to see it is in the actual agreements and in the actual, let's say, in the actual partnership work that is happening here. So, no, we're definitely not there where we would like to be. I mean, Ukraine has to be dealt with in a different way. Just with the European neighborhood policy is just something which is very nice, but it's just not enough, especially when you think, again, historically, the way that Ukraine has taken just recently in the last couple of decades by being a country that has approached Europe in an extremely positive way, was then temporarily drawn back by a communist president in a different direction who was breaking all former agreements. So then that the population had, with big victims, again get up and say, no, we are actual Europeans. That is something which I find absolutely amazing, because the statement of the people in Ukraine, and also, of course, particularly also the people in Kiev, is something which is absolutely fascinating and should be like a serious wake-up call to the European institutions to see how strong this European spirit is actually present. I mean, I can also say from the other way around, I don't know, some of you know that I work with some media in the Ukraine, and I work with the radio station. And for me, it is absolutely fascinating to see on how well European programs are actually received in the Ukraine, how important it is. We have for some time really played on a daily basis, presented a European country on a daily basis, a different European country on a daily basis, with all different aspects of that country, down to an extent that we were talking about the traffic problems and things like this. And just to see how important this was taken in the Ukraine and how positive this was received was something which was absolutely stunning to me. And again, for me, a clear symbol on how important it is to work very hard on that integration and do it as fast as possible. Well, thank you very much. I think what you have done also is very well described the role that those organizations that are participating in this conference have to play, and that they are trying to play anyway to some degree, but we all have to be much more stronger in our efforts to do something about that. I mean, it is definitely a role of the Pan-European Union to be absolutely clear about what the, let's say, defense of European values actually means. And I think one of the big advantages we do have is that we do not have to think necessarily in election cycles. We can think long-term. We have to think long-term in this respect, and therefore show. And I'm very glad that you were also pointing to long-term, the long-term history that the Ukraine has with Europe in collaboration, not in collaboration, but as part of Europe. So we can think long-term, but of course we don't want to wait centuries or decades. We want to see it as soon as possible. And I think all our organizations here are really asked to be active and really promote the fact that Ukraine is an integral part of Europe and should be an integral part of the European Union. And we have to work on that. I mean, that is why we're here together. On the other side, when it comes to my engagement in the Ukraine, I mean, I have been there for now quite a couple of years. I think I started in 2007, actually. Yes, of course, I have the intention to stay in whatever is the right way in my engagement for the Ukraine, because I am so totally convinced. I have made so many positive experiences, and I have such great collaborators that, yes, of course, I also want to stay engaged in one or another way on the media front in the Ukraine, because I think it is very important.
Дуже дякую, пане Карло, за вашу відповідь. Ми бачили, було ще одне питання у дівчинки. І ще.
So can I speak English? Yes. Firstly, I want to say thank you for this amazing speech, and especially I was impressed with the topic because as an Ukrainian girl, I'm very pleased to hear that Europe is not completed without Ukraine. So do you think all countries of European Union agree with this statement or not? And if not, what can we, especially Ukrainian youth, can do to improve it?
Well, thank you very much for this question. I think what we are one of the biggest problems we're having is the fact that there is, of course, not enough information going around in the media or in general about the situation that the Ukraine is in. Of course, I don't hear enough. And I'm one person that is really following the media very intensely, obviously, not only professionally, because also as my passion, I'm following it. There is definitely not enough information going on, pointing out where the real problems are, pointing out the fact that there is a European country that is partly occupied by its neighbor, where its neighbor is enacting an incredibly undue influence in a very good part of it, and that it is an actual daily struggle, that there is a war going on. That's just something that we do not really feel that way in many parts of the European Union. I don't want to point fingers at certain countries because I think that would not make sense. Some are, of course, more removed from the problem, and some of them are much closer and see the problematic much closer. But what we have to see, and what we should never forget, is that there is an incredible violation happening there of what we consider our integral European values. And I think that's something we have to point out all the time. And there also the pan-European youth and the European youth is really there's a demand for them to kind of spread that news, because as we have seen on one side with how modern media can be used, I know that with the possibilities of social media that we are having today, every single one of us can have an impact. Nobody can be completely left out from their responsibilities also towards their country and working towards their ideals. So I think I'll thank you very much for your question and for your statement, because I think everybody should take up their responsibility and point out within the framework of media or social media that they have on the situation the Ukraine is in, and something really has to be done about that on the long term, and who is in the right and who is in the wrong on that question. So thank you very much for your statement.
Ми продовжуємо нашу роботу. Любий Карле, наш один із попередніх дописувачів, виступаючих, назвав 3 головних успіхи України за 30 років незалежності, 3 головних упущення, які були зроблені, і 3 головних завдання, які стоять зараз перед Україною. Ти давно знаєш Україну, цікавишся Україною, бував неодноразово в Україні. Ось твій погляд збоку, якби ти міг сформулювати ці 30 років, які ми пройшли, які з твоєї точки зору найбільші успіхи, що упустили, і які зараз з твоєї точки зору головні завдання перед Україною?
I mean, if I'm watching the long-term development that has happened over the last 30 years, of course, there is a development. There are certain developments in the Ukraine that are going a little bit too slow. There is no doubt about that. I mean, the general fight against corruption, which is happening here, is just something which needs a greater attention and a greater effort, because that is also something which gets argued immediately in the West, in looking into the Ukraine and going like on how many elements of the Ukraine are still having some rather encrusted and corrupt administrative elements in it. So that is definitely a problem that Ukraine can work on its more modern image. What I find absolutely fascinating, anybody going to Kiev sees that it is an absolute modern, classical European town. So when you go and visit Ukraine, or you also to those cities that I have the possibility to visit a little bit more often, which yes, are of course a little bit more the Western Ukrainian, when I go to Chernivtsi or when I go to Lviv, yes, these are modern, classical European towns, and that's not necessarily what people do expect. So I think it would be great to promote them as such, to promote the tourism also to those areas, because there's a huge amount of history, there's a huge amount of culture, and I'm very glad that culture was already mentioned here before as a very important element, showing that it is a classical European culture which is there, showing these sort of things. Yes, a lot of development is necessary, not only on the side of the European Union, but definitely also on the Ukrainian side, to promote the picture that they are actually that they actually have, that you can find when you come to the Ukraine. That's what people do not really expect, and that's one thing that I would just love to see changed as fast as possible.
Дякую. Будь ласка, ще питання. Аня, я бачу. Там. Тоді продовжуємо нашу роботу і, відповідно, ще в мене таке питання. Ми знаємо, що, наприклад, в Європі, в тому числі в Австрії і Німеччині, була велика кількість тих, кого називали Путін-ферштеєр. Тих, хто Путін розуміє. Ось з 2014 року по 2021 рік, за твоїм баченням, ця частка тих, хто розуміє Путіна в його діяльності на Україні, вона залишилася константою, вона зменшилася чи вона збільшилася?
I personally think that it is the same group of people that pretend that they understand or show some understanding for the position that Putin is taking in relationship to the Ukraine. But of course, the longer he is staying in power, the more those people get basically justified, because they have the feeling that not too much is happening to actually make him responsible for the deeds that he has done. I think it is absolutely fascinating and a very interesting discussion when you see how much Putin obviously is afraid of his own situation currently. When you look at the current election campaign and the impact that somebody whom he has put illegally and against European advice into jail, and I'm obviously talking about Mr. Navalny, how much he is obviously afraid of. When you see all the legal positions he is taking, he's extremely afraid of a more liberal, a more free system in Russia, something that can be found in the Ukraine, for which Ukraine is an example that this is absolutely possible. So the repressive system is becoming to an extent that it is absolutely fascinating. I mean, the measures that he's taking also, let's say the legal measures that he's taking by criminalizing anybody who has ever over the last decade even have given the most small contribution to the Navalny movement and excluding them, these people from active political career or anything like this, it just shows how much he is afraid of freedom, of liberty, of those values that we are actually representing here. And those people that are Putin-Versteher, that were exactly put in this category. Most of them, of course, have never been to Russia. They have never experienced the situation that people that want to be politically active, that want to play a role in public life, which is something which is completely normal for all of us, how this is absolutely impossible to do in Russia unless you are following 100% the party line and the whim and will of the current government. So I just think Ukraine is playing a very, very interesting role in that, to also show that a country which, of course, has a very good percentage of Russian speakers, like Ukraine has, although, of course, it is the Ukrainian, how would I say, it's very strongly, luckily, very strongly Ukrainian influence. But I think this is an example that is always very good, and that is also making Russia frightened. And they are using all their means, especially also all their media means, all we're not only looking at RT as a propaganda, as a pure propaganda instrument, but also, let's say, the St. Petersburg troll factories and these sort of instruments that are used to kind of change this perception, and therefore support the Putin verstehers and give them respective ammunition that they can try to explain why it is so important to not touch, not change anything in Russia.
Herzlichen Dank. Дякую, Карл. І якщо можна, я в продовження все-таки ще одне питання. 23 серпня ми провели Кримську платформу в Україні. І я віддаю належність нинішній владі України, що вона повернула, чи наголос зробила значно сильніший на питання Криму, ніж це було десь трошки в попередній період. Твоє сприйняття, твоє бачення Кримської платформи – це перше питання. Друге, як відреагувало суспільство австрійське на Кримську платформу, яку провела Україна? У суспільній думці яке було сприйняття?
And how many people in Europe do know?
I think one of the profound problems of Crimea is the fact that, of course, anything happening there, or the fact that it is an occupied territory, has been completely overshadowed by what is happening in the Donbass. So the general perception in the West, and that comprises also many, let's say, parts of Austrian society, is that Crimea is more or less fait accompli, and let's deal, if we are dealing with anything, let's deal with what's happening in the Donbass, and therefore the Crimea problem has been completely pushed aside. And that's a very dangerous perception. I think it is. I was very glad about Crimea at least being pushed a little bit more in the forefront of the media through the summit, just to show that it is not just a fait accompli, but it is something which is definitely not dissolved. We are talking about borders that have been guaranteed, amongst others, by Russia and lots of other guarantors that were making it absolutely clear that Crimea is an integral part of the Ukraine and has to stay so in the future, and cannot just be taken as the price that has to be paid for probably keeping more calm in eastern Ukraine. That is absolutely not possible. Frankly, I probably do not spend enough time in Austria itself to report on the Austrian perception on this specifically, but I can see overall that it is just incredibly important to keep Crimea also on the table, keep it in the discussion, only because it is not as violent as what is happening in the Donbass that we cannot forget about it. It has to be part and parcel of re-establishing the rightful territory of Ukraine.
One more question, please. As we all know, economical sanctions didn't work, obviously. So what do you think? What measures or steps should Europe do to to force Russia do not do what Russia does with Crimea and Donbass? Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right that widespread economic sanctions do not work. And they do not work for many specific reasons, because of course sanctions are always reciprocal, which means that probably, let's say, farmers in somewhere in Europe are suffering more under those sanctions than actually what is happening in Russia. What I think is much more functional and much more important is to talk about sanctions for individuals, because of course we have to see who are the enablers of that politic. It is not only, let's say, the immediate politicians, not only, let's say, the president who is kind of following this policy and who is basically giving the framework in which the policy has to work, but he has a lot of enablers. And what we have to do is we have to put sanctions on those enablers, which many of them are those oligarchs that are supporting him and allowing him a financial situation that he can basically do whatever he wants, and that he's probably the richest person in the world today. So I think it is very important to think about what do those enablers want, how do they want to live, and what can we do to sanction them directly. I think Bill Browder is, of course, one of the great promoters of the Magnitsky Act. And the Magnitsky Act is something that has to be used. Luckily, many countries have taken on the Magnitsky Act as their within their framework of legislation. And I think it is very important that we are really pushing this as a system, that those enablers get sanctioned, because we should not forget one thing. Many of those enablers, which are incredibly rich, feel much more threatened through individual sanctions than through, let's say, broad spread sanctions, because if it's targeting them personally, they are all saying, we are Russian, we want to be there, we have everything what we want. But what they all want at the same time is they want to have a little house on the Côte d'Azur. They want to send their children either to British or to Swiss schools. They want to go shopping to Paris and New York. They want to do all these sort of things, which suddenly, if these individual sanctions would work, would be out of the questions, including the bank accounts in many of those countries that they are still using today. So I think that's what we should be doing, is really go for the enablers, because I think that is the only type of sanctions that has shown that they do work.
Дякую, Карл. Тут у нас надійшло запитання від наших онлайн-учасників. І вони говорять про те, що Кримська платформа – це вже більш така новий шлях, да? Більш молодіжний шлях, коли, відповідно, ми все-таки нагадуємо про те, що питання Криму не закрито. І в зв'язку з цим, з твоєї точки зору, що могла би Україна у цьому відношенні ще більше, відповідно, запропонувати того, ось як ціннісні проекти ЄС?
Well, I think the answer is a little bit in the question. The important thing is to keep the knowledge awake about what's happening here. We are kind of, you know, one of the general problems we're having also from the point of view of media and point of view of perception is that always one catastrophe is overruling the next catastrophe. We have unsolved problems, but then we only have the problem unsolved until the next problem shows up, which is more important, and then the old unsolved problem just gets forgotten. And that is a little bit what has happened to Crimea. Other more relevant and more violent elements have come up, and therefore this is a problem that has been forgotten. So anything that keeps this problem in the forefront of our mind, saying this is an unsolved problem that needs, this is an unsolved element that needs a solution, and it needs a solution based on the rule of law, that needs a solution that actually does fulfill those guarantees that guarantors, which include Russia, that's something we have to point out again and again and again, about the integrity of the Ukrainian borders, that this is getting respected and that is getting reestablished. I think anything that keeps this in mind, whatever platform, whatever media, all of this is, I think, really of the great importance. And I think we also have to keep our, let's say, and I'm now talking as a member of the European Union, keep our representatives within their responsibility and push them that whenever they are dealing with Russia, whenever they are dealing with oppression, like the way it's happening there, that these are the problems that get also mentioned and get put into the package of problems that have to be solved.
Дякую, Карл. Я би хотів тобі, якщо Бенедикт теж слухає, Бенедикту питання, можливо, вдвох відповіли. Ось 30 років незалежності України. Твоє перше враження від поїздки в Україну і твоє враження про Україну сьогоднішню. І якщо Бенедикт може, Бенедикт теж міг би відповісти на це питання.
I think, Igor, you will have to decide who answers first.
You may start.
Karl. Yeah.
As you are already here, yeah.
No, I mean, I think there is absolutely no comparison. When I had the possibility for the first time to get to the Ukraine, at that time I was only visiting the western part of Ukraine, the part to which, of course, obviously we have a very historic relationship to. So yes, the development that you can see also how cities represent themselves, how the infrastructure is developing, that is something which is absolutely tremendous. I mean, you see an incredible move forwards. What one has to say also, but is the further you go east within the Ukraine, the less the less of the progress you actually see. So for me, to some degree, it's of course also an element where I have to say that, yes, those parts of Ukraine that are closer on the border with a free society, with a free market economy, of course, can profit more from that. And I think it is in all our interest to see that all of Ukraine will be able to profit from that type of overall European free market economy. But I mean, the progress is absolutely tremendous.
Бенедикт, я щось не бачу. А Карл, можна тобі поставити останнє особисто провокативне питання? Твоє відчуття, коли ти перший раз приїхав на Західну Україну, як внук останнього австрійського імператора. Це були ваші володіння, а тепер, відповідно, це незалежна територія.
I mean, it's very difficult to describe because, of course, since I have not experienced the time of the monarchy, it's just something that I'm looking at history like everybody else is looking at history, maybe with a little bit more of a personal connection in some way. I mean, I could see with my father when he did trips to the Ukraine, it was something which was very close to him because, of course, he was able to relate to a lot of places where his father, at that time, not yet emperor, but still Archduke Karl, when he was stationed in Kolomea, when he was stationed in that area, the relationship that he could develop to that area. That was something that he felt very personal. But of course, I have to say, I feel very much at home in the Ukraine, because it is an area that I can culturally and from the point of view of society very much relate to. I feel very much at home there, like in some other parts of Europe. But it's definitely one part of Europe that I feel very much at home in.
Дякую.